The smell of burning gasoline hit me before I even heard my daughter scream, a sound so sharp it cut through the heavy night air like broken glass. 1 second I was sipping lukewarm coffee after a late shift, the next I was sprinting barefoot down the driveway as thick black smoke twisted upward against the moonlight. Our quiet suburban street, normally alive with sprinklers and porch lights, looked eerily still, every house dark as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. My heart hammered as the sight seared into me. My daughter's wheelchair was tipped beside the car, its frame glowing red from the reflection of growing flames, and inside the locked vehicle her tiny fists pounded on the window. Training took over. Years of fire calls had drilled into me how fast heat can spike and how little oxygen a sealed cabin holds, but nothing in the academy had prepared me for seeing my own child trapped inside. I yanked at the handle, jammed. Smoke clawed at my lungs. The smell of melting plastic and scorched upholstery wrapped around me, a cruel countdown I could almost hear. My mind raced for every tool, every tactic, every second that might save her, but another detail pierced through the chaos: the driver's side door was locked from outside, not inside. Someone had turned a key. I spun, scanning the shadows of manicured lawns and silent mailboxes, and that's when I caught the faint glint of metal at the edge of the hedge, someone holding the key to my daughter's prison, waiting. For years before that horrific night, life in our quiet cul-de-sac felt like the reward for every risk I had taken as a firefighter and every lonely hour I had spent raising my daughter alone. After my wife passed away, every decision I made revolved around giving Lily the stability and comfort she deserved. Our new house in the HOA neighborhood seemed like the perfect choice, a single-level ranch with wide doorways, smooth ramps, and a big backyard where she could will herself out to feed the birds or paint under the maple tree. Mornings followed a gentle rhythm. I'd brew coffee while she stirred oatmeal at the kitchen island, sunlight spilling across the white countertops. Neighbors jogged by with friendly waves, and I finally exhaled, believing I had found a safe place for her childhood. The first time I met Karen, the HOA president, she wore a tight smile and a clipboard, her eyes darting from our wheelchair ramp to the small fire department decal on my truck. She welcomed us with a handshake that felt more like an inspection. At first her concerns sounded polite, questions about our trash bin schedule, friendly reminders about mailbox paint colors, but soon the notes in our mailbox multiplied. One week it was a warning about the non-conforming slope of the ramp, another week she complained about the unsightly emergency exit light by the back door. I paid the small fines and tried to stay neighborly, thinking it was just a detail-oriented community. But the tone of her letters sharpened, each sentence tighter and colder, and at the first HOA meeting I attended, I noticed the quick way she dismissed any neighbor who questioned her authority. Her smile never reached her eyes. The final straw came on a breezy Thursday afternoon when I discovered a plain envelope wedged into our front door, no stamp or return address, just my name written in an angry scrawl. Inside, a single sheet warned that non-compliance with community aesthetics will bring consequences you won't like. Standing on the porch with the note trembling in my hand, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening wind. For the first time since moving in, I locked our doors before sunset and wondered if the home I had chosen for safety might become the very place where danger would come looking for us. What began as scattered warnings soon hardened into a steady drumbeat of hostility that made every sunrise feel like a new battle. Karen's first direct attack came on a Saturday morning when I found a bright orange violation notice taped across our front window like a scarlet letter, declaring our wheelchair ramp a non-approved structure and threatening daily fines until it was removed or rebuilt. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, staring at the absurd accusation. Our ramp had been professionally built to code and permitted by the city, but the letter's signature in Karen's looping script left no doubt who had orchestrated it. When I called the HOA office for clarification, a bored voice told me to bring my special needs documentation to the next board meeting, as if my daughter's wheelchair was some optional accessory we were abusing for sympathy. At that meeting, the simmering tension finally boiled. I arrived with blueprints, permits, and a determination to stay calm, but Karen opened the session with a brittle laugh and a pointed question about whether certain residents believed the rules applied to them. Her allies, 2 board members who nodded at her every word, piled on with concerns about property values and neighborhood uniformity. Each time I tried to explain, she interrupted with sharper accusations, her voice rising until the room felt electrified with her contempt. Neighbors who once waved at us now kept their eyes on their shoes, unwilling to challenge her. That night a typed complaint about unauthorized emergency lighting appeared in our mailbox, unsigned but unmistakably hers, and the following week I found deep scratches gouged along the side of my truck as if someone had dragged a key with deliberate force. I installed security cameras, but each time I checked the footage I caught only vague shadows, too distant, too convenient to identify. Then came the morning when Lily and I stepped outside to a thick acrid smell and discovered our welcome mat charred to a brittle black curl. The fire had been small and quick, but it was the clearest message yet. I knelt beside the ashes, the chill of the concrete seeping through my knees, and knew this was no longer about HOA bylaws or landscaping preferences. Karen had crossed an invisible line, transforming from a petty rule enforcer into a predator testing the edges of violence. As I swept away the remnants of the mat, a single thought pulsed through me like an alarm bell. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was the opening move of a war I could no longer ignore. The night of the fire began deceptively calm, a velvet black sky stretched over the neighborhood as if nothing could break its stillness, yet an undercurrent of unease threaded through every shadow on our street. After a long shift I had finally settled with a cup of coffee, but a faint acrid scent drifted through the kitchen window. Electrical, metallic, wrong, and a low popping sound followed, soft at first then sharp enough to rattle the glass. Years of firefighting instincts snapped awake. I dashed to the driveway and froze. A dull orange glow pulsed inside our minivan like a heartbeat gone wild. Through the smoke-blurred windshield I saw the faint outline of Lily's wheelchair, empty, thank God, but the vehicle itself hissed with the fury of shorted wires, flames licking along the dashboard where a faulty charging cable sparked like a live snake. I lunged for the hose only to discover the spigot handle had been jammed with hardened glue. The nozzle wouldn't budge no matter how hard I twisted. Panic spiked as I heard neighbors shouting and a second sound cut through, the heavy clang of the HOA's emergency gate slamming shut, a gate that Karen alone controlled and which now sealed off the direct access route for the fire department. My heart hammered as training overrode fear. I grabbed my turnout coat from the hall closet, yanked the fire extinguisher free, and sprinted back into the smoke that curled like dark silk across the yard. Heat radiated in savage waves, every step closer felt like wading into a furnace. I smashed the side window with a gloved elbow, glass exploding outward as fire roared oxygen-hungry in response, and with practiced precision I swept the extinguisher's nozzle across the interior, carving white foam through the rolling black smoke. Sparks spat back like angry wasps, forcing me to crouch low and work in sweeping arcs until the flames guttered to a hiss. Behind me the wail of approaching sirens tangled with the shouts of neighbors gathering at the perimeter, their faces ghost-lit and wide-eyed, but the main entrance remained chained and locked, every second adding to the response delay. I shouted for bolt cutters, for buckets, for anyone with a crowbar to pry the gate, and we formed a frantic relay while I kept the fire from reigniting by ripping away smoldering upholstery and isolating the battery pack. When the first engine finally arrived, its red strobes bleeding across the smoke, the crew had to ram the gate off its hinges, a delay later logged by the chief as critical. Only then did I allow myself to breathe and feel the tremor in my arms. A neighbor's home security camera later confirmed what my gut had suspected. Hours earlier Karen had been seen inspecting the gate and tampering with the lock, claiming to double secure it for safety. Whether she intended sabotage or simply indulged another power trip, her negligence turned a minor electrical fire into a full-blown emergency that could have taken lives. Standing in the chemical mist, soot streaking my gear, I watched as the last pockets of flame curled into steam and felt a cold fury settle where panic had burned. Lily, who had slept through the first alarms inside the house thanks to the thick insulated windows, woke to find me smoke-streaked and shaking, and I hugged her so tightly she squeaked a protest, the smell of burnt rubber and melted plastic forever welding this night into our memories. The firefighters on scene exchanged knowing looks as they documented the glued spigot and locked gate, details that turned coincidence into a pattern of reckless endangerment. By the time dawn softened the smoke-stained sky, my relief had hardened into resolve. Karen's petty war on ramps and lights had crossed into life-threatening territory, and this time I would bring every ounce of evidence, every report, and every ounce of firefighter tenacity to ensure she never gambled with another life again. By the time the last firetruck rolled away and the acrid smell of scorched vinyl finally began to thin, the relief of survival was quickly replaced by a numbing disbelief that deepened with every official conversation that followed. The police who arrived in the early dawn took notes and nodded at the evidence: the glued spigot handle, the forcibly locked HOA gate that delayed the engines, yet their questions tilted toward coincidence, as though hardened glue might appear overnight by chance and gates might seal themselves. Karen emerged from her porch wearing a robe and an air of shocked innocence, clutching a steaming mug as if she had been roused from sleep by distant commotion rather than standing yards from a near disaster. With the poise of someone long practiced in neighborhood politics, she expressed deep concern for our safety and suggested maybe a teen prankster was to blame, shaking her head at the tragedy of modern electronics. When I pointed out that multiple cameras had caught her near the gate hours before, she countered smoothly that she had been inspecting the neighborhood for everyone's protection, a phrase the responding officer jotted down without a flicker of doubt. By mid-morning the HOA board gathered in a quick, emergency session that felt anything but urgent. I sat under fluorescent lights while Karen's allies, two men who had parroted her objections to our wheelchair ramp, spoke in measured tones about how unfortunate accidents happen with aging vehicles and how community cohesion required we avoid rash accusations. Every sentence felt rehearsed, every sympathetic nod a silent vote to protect their president. When I demanded an independent arson investigator, the treasurer cleared his throat and reminded me that HOA bylaws encouraged internal resolution first. My homeowner's insurance agent echoed the skepticism, calling the case ambiguous and warning that electrical fires often leave little to prove criminal intent. Even the city inspector hesitated, citing backlogs and the need for clear evidence of tampering beyond reasonable doubt. Each polite dismissal landed like a hammer. At home, the invisible damage multiplied. Lily startled awake at every creak of the house, her dreams thick with phantom sirens. The smell of smoke, faint but persistent in the drapes, triggered tears she tried to hide behind a brave smile. I moved her bed closer to mine and kept a go-bag by the door, my own sleep splintered into restless intervals haunted by the hiss of flames and the memory of Karen's unruffled voice. Friends from the firehouse dropped by with casseroles and offers of help, their quiet glances telling me they, too, sensed something foul in the official calm. Yet each call to the insurance company yielded only new forms, each visit from the HOA produced another reminder of community standards, as if paperwork could paper over intent. Days stretched into a week of stalled reports and cautious phrasing until frustration hardened into a slow-burning fury. I replayed security footage frame by frame, catalogued every violation notice, and compiled a timeline that traced Karen's vendetta from nitpicking letters to dangerous obstruction. Still, the machinery of neighborhood governance ground forward like a well-oiled shield around her. One evening, after tucking Lily in and double-checking every lock, I stood alone in the kitchen and felt the weight of silence pressing down. The official systems, insurance adjusters, HOA committees, even the first responders who should have been allies, were built to smooth conflict, not to confront a predator wrapped in civic titles. Staring at the charred skeleton of our van through the window, I felt the truth settle like ash: if the law would not protect my child, then I would gather every fact, every witness, and every ounce of my training to protect her myself and to ensure that Karen's quiet war would end on my terms, not hers. I turned the fury I felt into a methodical machine. Revenge for what Karen had almost taken from us wouldn't be loud and reckless, it would be surgical, legal, and impossible to ignore. First, I mapped every piece of evidence I already had: the security footage that showed her near the gate, the jammed spigot, the anonymous complaint letters, the scratched truck, and the charred welcome mat. I catalogued them with timestamps and notes, then set about filling the gaps. Under the cover of early morning runs I pretended to jog past neighbors' houses and used those routes to ask casual questions. Did anyone hear a car idling late? Did anyone see someone with a crowbar? while actually looking for cameras I hadn't noticed before. I knocked on doors with a polite smile, offering to swap out a neighbor's dead smoke alarm battery or help adjust a camera angle. More often than not, people admitted they had footage they'd never looked at. One retired teacher handed me a thumb drive with a night of grainy footage that, when sharpened, showed a shadowy figure loitering by the gate 3 hours before the fire alarm. Another neighbor's doorbell camera caught a car with an unregistered plate parked across the street at odd hours. I brought those clips back to the station and worked the problem like it was another call: isolate frames, enhance audio where possible, freeze and compare. My captain, one of the few people who knew how deeply this went, ran a quick arson primer with me, teaching me to look for signs that separate accident from intent, unusual points of origin, accelerant patterns, multiple ignition sites, and evidence of tampering with suppression systems. He connected me with a civilian arson investigator he trusted, someone who, after a thorough look, wrote back with cautious language that nonetheless gave me hope. The spigot showed foreign adhesive consistent with deliberate jamming, and the gate's lock bore fresh tool marks beneath a coat of paint. Armed with initials and reports, I began to assemble a packet that would be impossible to wave away as bad luck. While evidence collection felt like detective work, I also understood the theater of accusation. Facts needed context, and context needed witnesses. I quietly interviewed neighbors, recording their statements on my phone with their permission, making sure to ask open questions that invited frank recollection. What did you see the night before? Who do you recall acting unusual in the last few weeks? Rather than leading them. Their faces, when they finally spoke without the pressure of the HOA room, revealed truths the boardroom hadn't wanted to hear. Karen had an intensity, a need for control, that tipped into recklessness. Some admitted they'd been intimidated into silence at meetings, others confessed they'd assumed my complaints were overreactions. I promised each of them anonymity until the right moment. What I needed was enough corroborated testimony to show a pattern, not a single angry neighbor's claim. Next, I prepared for the legal angle. I spent nights reading municipal codes, HOA bylaws, and fire safety statutes until my eyes blurred. I learned the precise language that would make the difference between an unfortunate incident and reckless endangerment in the eyes of a prosecutor. I drafted a formal complaint and had a volunteer paralegal friend review the structure so it would meet filing standards. I arranged for the arson investigator to draw a clear, professional report complete with photos and a chain of custody log for the glove with adhesive residue we'd recovered from the spigot. The paperwork was dry, but its teeth were real. The plan for the showdown began to take shape: present the packet to the city's fire marshal, serve a copy to the HOA board, and, crucially, invite a local news crew to the emergency HOA meeting I demanded. I knew public scrutiny would change the dynamics. People who cowered in private rooms would balk under cameras and live questions. To keep the element of surprise, I staged the timing. The investigator's report would be finalized the morning of the meeting, the news crew briefed to arrive early, and the compiled packet hand-delivered to the marshal that same day. Tension threaded through the process. Several times I nearly lost it. Once, while adjusting a neighbor's camera that I'd asked them to point toward the gate, I heard footsteps behind me and my hands froze. Karen had stepped out in a robe to retrieve a newspaper and her gaze flicked toward the camera as if sensing it, then slid away with a practiced smile. My pulse spiked, but I kept my voice steady and said nothing about the footage, pretending the angle needed adjustment for glare. Another time, an HOA board member called to say he'd found additional paperwork in his mailbox and would bring it to the meeting, documents I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped until I realized they were Karen's prepared defenses, full of conjecture but no substance. Each near miss taught me to move more carefully, to encrypt files, to back up drives in multiple places, and to rehearse the sequence of revelation so that when the packet hit the table there would be no holes to exploit. Throughout it all, Lily's safety remained my North Star. Every covert camera, every witness interview, every legal footnote was done to make sure she could sleep without the smell of smoke invading her dreams. By the time I printed the final copies and slid one into a stamped envelope for the fire marshal, the trap felt less like vengeance and more like making the world accountable. I wasn't setting a snare to humiliate, I was building an undeniable architecture of truth. The last night before the meeting I sat at the kitchen table with the packet spread like a map, the neighborhood silent outside, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself a measured breath, calm, not victory. The next morning would either force Karen into exposure or finally prove how far a person could hide behind bylaws and smiles. Either way, I was ready to pull the curtain. The morning of the emergency HOA meeting dawned cold and bright, the kind of sharp autumn day where every sound carries, and I walked into the clubhouse with my evidence binder under one arm and the quiet steadiness of someone who knows the truth is finally ready to speak for itself. Neighbors filled the folding chairs in uneasy clusters, whispering as local news cameras hummed to life along the back wall. Karen sat at the head of the board table in a tailored blazer, her trademark tight smile fixed in place, a stack of neatly arranged papers in front of her like a fortress. When the chairperson called the meeting to order, she opened with rehearsed concern about recent unfortunate events, but her voice faltered as I rose and began to lay out my packet: surveillance stills of her near the gate hours before the fire, the investigator's report proving the water spigot had been deliberately glued, close-up photographs of tool marks on the HOA lock, sworn statements from neighbors who admitted they had been pressured to stay quiet, and the fire marshal's official classification of the blaze as aggravated negligence with indicators of intent. Murmurs rippled across the room as I flipped each page and a local reporter's camera zoomed in. A neighbor gasped when I played the enhanced clip of her figure in the shadows by the gate. Karen's smile cracked, then hardened, and she tried to pivot, claiming she'd been conducting a late-night safety check and suggesting the footage was misleading, but the fire marshal, who had quietly entered midway, stepped forward to state on record that tampering with fire suppression and emergency access constitutes reckless endangerment under city law. The board members shifted in their seats, suddenly unwilling to meet her eyes. When an officer who had been conferring with the marshal announced that a warrant had been approved to inspect Karen's toolshed for adhesives and gate keys, the room went silent except for the click of camera shutters. Karen's composure shattered. She rose so abruptly her chair toppled, denying everything, accusing me of vendettas and even blaming the malfunctioning vehicle, until the officer calmly placed a hand on her arm and read her rights. Gasps filled the hall as she was escorted outside, still protesting but drowned by the collective murmur of neighbors who now saw clearly what they had chosen to ignore. The board voted on the spot to suspend her presidency, and a motion to pursue civil damages passed unanimously. Relief flooded me like cool water after a long fire call, not gloating, but a deep exhale that the nightmare was finally over. Outside, Lily sat on the clubhouse steps wrapped in a borrowed blanket, and when I knelt beside her she smiled for the first time in weeks, her small hand gripping mine with quiet strength. Cameras clicked again as the morning sun lit the charred van at the curb, now less a symbol of fear and more of survival. For the first time since smoke filled our driveway, I felt the neighborhood itself breathe again, free of the shadow Karen had cast. When the last news crew packed up and the police cars finally rolled away, the neighborhood seemed to exhale as if a long-held breath had been released, and for the first time in weeks the air smelled of autumn leaves instead of smoke. Inside our home, repairs were already underway, the charred van scheduled for replacement, the scorched driveway scrubbed clean, yet the deepest restoration happened within the quiet moments between Lily and me. Each evening we reclaimed a bit more normalcy, laughter at the dinner table, wheelchair races to the mailbox, bedtime stories uninterrupted by sirens or nightmares. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped by with warm meals and heartfelt apologies, determined to help rebuild not only our property but the sense of trust Karen had poisoned. The HOA board, stripped of her influence, passed new emergency access bylaws and funded a neighborhood fire safety upgrade, a change that turned our ordeal into a model of preparedness for surrounding communities. Watching Lily's smile return as she painted a bright mural of fire trucks and blue skies on the garage wall, I felt gratitude stronger than any anger, gratitude for the firefighters who responded despite locked gates, for the neighbors who finally spoke truth, and for the quiet resilience that kept us moving forward when institutions hesitated. But the lesson was unmistakable: complacency lets bullies thrive, and silence can be as dangerous as flame. So as I share this story with you, I ask you to stand with us. If you believe every child deserves safety and every family deserves a home free from intimidation, share our experience and subscribe to this channel. Together we can make sure no Karen, no bully in any neighborhood, ever silences another family's right to peace and protection again.